Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizing committee, to the whole member of it. Thank you very much, distinguished speakers, for the predecessors' speeches. And let me present the topic of specialities of internal, external, criminal, and infringement investigations, interoperability between these procedures in Poland. I hope the slides are visible and you hear me well. Let me present the presentation, which will cover such aspects as, firstly, the delimitation of the types of different proceedings, both internal and external, criminal and non-criminal ones. Then the characteristic of the presented proceedings and the interoperability of the discussed proceedings accordingly to the Polish legal system. The speech will be an attempt to show them in a context of protection of the financial interests of the European Union. And the first step for the analysis is to present the delimitation of types of proceedings, which can be described as representative and investigation, repressive and investigation proceedings. All of them can and are used also for combating frauds, money laundering, or other illegal activities which can affect the financial interests of the EU or the public funds. And each of them has a different aim and is conducted by different authorities, different bodies. What they have in common is their subject, conduct which is an act or omission in violation of the universally applicable law or internal regulations of the organization. And to my mind, it is possible to distinguish three categories of proceedings in the Polish legal system which are related to the protection of the financial interests of the European Union. The first category is are proceedings connected with criminal liability or criminal responsibility. Here there are four main types of proceedings which are based on the universally applicable law, and I present them briefly today. Let me enumerate them. So here we have common criminal procedure, then misdemeanor cases proceedings, fiscal penal proceedings, and collective entities criminal liability proceedings. We can call all of them external proceedings as they are not bound with any private law entity in terms of their conduct, and they are led by the law enforcement authorities, what means mainly the public prosecutor office and police. The second category, which I can enumerate it here, is there are proceedings connected with repressive responsibility, but not a criminal one. And they are also based on the universally applicable law. They usually are internal proceedings, what means that they are led by bodies appointed by an employer. And as an example, here are disciplinary proceedings against officers of police formations, like, for example, border guard or police. And then there's the third category. The third category is internal proceedings, which are in principle not connected with any universally applicable law responsibility. They are usually based on the internal norms of an organization and are led by bodies appointed by an employer. What can be put here as an example is whistleblowing internal proceedings, which are included in anti-money laundering regulations. Let me focus on the first group of proceedings, the one which can be described as criminal proceedings. What is a common factor for all four types of proceedings I present in a minute is criminal responsibility, which is individual in the Polish legal system. Each of the presented proceedings is a kind of tool to combat crimes that can affect the EU financial system, and each of them is focused on slightly different aspects. The group consists, as I mentioned before, four different paths of claiming criminal responsibility. It means common criminal proceedings, misdemeanor cases proceedings, fiscal penal proceedings, and collective entities criminal liability proceedings. The first type is the criminal proceedings, which consist of common criminal proceedings before common criminal courts and before the tribunal of state. It is generally regulated by the Criminal Proceedings Code. And as the aim of these proceedings is to achieve a state of substantive justice and appropriate criminal reaction. The latter means who is guilty of an offense should bear the responsibility for it just and only as he or she deserves under the criminal law. Its essence, therefore, is not to punish the innocent and punish the guilty one. The process should also aim at the proceedings should also aim at specifying the norm of substantive criminal law. In other words, changing an abstract legal norm into a concrete norm aimed at a specific human activity. How can it resonate with the EU financial interests? Firstly, the common criminal proceedings are the most frequent type of proceedings connected with criminal liability. This form of proceedings generally is initiated and or prosecuted ex officio, so by the public prosecutor's office or by police. They are also decided by the common criminal courts. And these proceedings are orientated for the prosecution of such crimes as, for example, corruption, money laundering, frustrating or obstructing a public tender. The first one, corruption, might take place during the EU funds distribution and seems to be one of those that can actualize, for example, during the EU reconstruction fund distribution. The other criminal proceedings are the special ones. It is before the Tribunal of State. The Tribunal of State is a special kind of court which jurisdictions cover violations of the Constitution or of a statute act of Parliament committed by and within the office or within its scope by the President, the Prime Minister, members of the Council of Ministers, so the government, and others who are constitutionally accountable to the Tribunal of States. The manner of proceeding is not often used. However, it might be a tool to fight offenses committed at the highest level of state power, especially those connected with major corruption or fraud cases that can be directly bounded with the EU financial interests. Another category I wanted to mention today is misdemeanor case proceedings. It is regulated by the Misdemeanor Proceedings Code. Misdemeanors include the smallest prohibited acts. usually with a low degree of harmfulness, and at the same time subject to lower sanctions. Misdemeanors may not be the most significant group of infringements associated with the EU financial interest, but still, they can indirectly affect those interests, especially in the event of a large number of smaller cases, which create an effect of scale. For example, misdemeanors against property or misdemeanors which can help to commit other prohibited acts like more serious crime, for example, such as producing seals or signs of a state or local government without proper order. Pointing the key differences between the criminal proceedings and the misdemeanor proceedings, the following issues should be mentioned here. Firstly, lack of preventive measures. Then, simplifications resulting from procedural economy. Exempli gratia, continuation of hearing despite a change in the composition of the court. Different poor evidentiary proceedings should be also pointed out here. Moreover, only exceptional participation of the public prosecutor in such cases can be brought to the light. And finally, a different catalog of negative prerequisites for the proceedings. The next type of proceedings, which I want to underline today, is the fiscal penal proceedings stated by the Fiscal Penal Code. This one can be described as one of the most appropriate to combat crimes against the EU financial interests. As an example, can serve one of the types of prohibited acts indicated in the Fiscal Penal Code, which states that whoever exposes public finances to depletion through undue payment, collection, or use a subsidy in a manner inconsistent with its intent, purpose, may be sanctioned. Also, different kinds of tax offenses and tax evasions are covered by the code. What should be underlined here is also the fact that the purpose of fiscal penal proceedings is defined by the legislator, its enforcement and compensation. What is worth underlying, penal fiscal law, since the adoption of the first Polish Penal Fiscal Act in 1926, showed differences from the general substantive criminal law and criminal proceedings. It clearly determines the appropriate differences from common criminal proceedings through inter alia distinctive and autonomous legal institutions, like, for example, the institution of voluntary accepting the responsibility. What I found also important is the fact that the authorities conducting the proceedings are different. These authorities include financial authorities, such as the head of the tax office, fiscal control inspector, head of the customs office, and non-financial authorities, such as border guard, police, military police, and in cases of tax offenses, also the Internal Security Agency and the Anti-Corruption Bureau. And coming to the last type of proceedings, which was enumerated, was a collective entities criminal liability proceeding based on the Act of Parliament dedicated to that issue. It should be noted here that this way of proceedings can also be used against offenses affecting the financial interests of the EU. The regulation is devoted to cases in which a collective entity shall be held liable for an offense involving the conduct of an individual, if the collective entity benefited or could have benefited from the conduct, even non-financially. Such circumstances may materialize, especially in the case of unlawful shared European funds or bid rigging. In the Polish legal system, the criminal liability of individuals is understood classically as the liability of natural persons. So, the criminal liability of collective entities does not have a long tradition in the Polish legal system. It has been in force in Polish law for about 10 years. And nevertheless, it can definitely be useful when having in mind such unlawful acts like those connected with frauds and money laundering issues. The Polish Act adopted a cascade model of liability of a collective entity depends on the finding that a crime or fiscal offense has been committed by a natural person functionally related to the entity. Only after the closing of criminal or penal fiscal proceedings in the case of a person functionally related to a collective entity, upon a motion submitted by a prosecutor, a proceeding on the liability of the collective entity is initiated. Such shaping of the model of liability has led to its little application in practice, despite the importance of goals and hopes for new possibilities of combating economic and organized crime, which can affect also the public finances as well as the EU financial interests, like, for example, when dealing with tenders regarding the project sponsored or co-funded by the EU subsidies. Let's move to the next category of proceedings, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Proceedings connected with repressive responsibility, but not a criminal one. Here, disciplinary proceedings should be pointed out. The essence of disciplinary relations are acts of authority in which the public entity exercising disciplinary power imperatively determines the professional status of the accused person. Disciplinary law is a group of social relations related to the legal consequences of violating obligation resulting from belonging to entities performing public functions. This way of proceedings protects indirectly the EU financial interests. For example, in cases of unlawful spending of EU funds, which were dedicated to the purchase of equipment for border guards or police, and it's also a mechanism for combating crimes related to unlawful disposition of property, which was founded from the EU subsidies. Disciplinary liability is inherently related to public law, both at the substantive and procedural levels. Disciplinary law, including procedural law, should be treated as a branch of the law of autonomous nature, also in relation to criminal law, as the latter one does not cover disciplinary proceedings, as criminal proceedings only deal with issues related to criminal liability, which disciplinary liability is not a kind of. What is worth underlining, disciplinary proceedings is an internal one, but it is also connected with the public law responsibility. The general feature of disciplinary proceedings is their internal nature with a given organizational structure, police formation, and civil servants applicable. It does not change the fact that the decision ending the proceedings may be subject to judicial review. And last but not least, the third category of proceedings are internal proceedings, which are not connected with any universally applicable law responsibility. In my opinion, this category includes whistleblowing internal investigations. Also, the whistleblowing internal investigations are quite sparingly regulated. What should I point out here are two types of whistleblowing system in Poland, mandatory and optional one. The first one is present in Polish law only by sector. Generally, the banking and finance services sector, civil aviation sector, institutions exposed to money laundering, and some entities of the mining sector are obliged to implement it. For the scope of the presentation, the most relevant regulations are those related to money laundering issues, especially due to cases when the EU funds might be involved. The universally applicable law regulations provide an outline of the mandatory whistleblowing system, but the exact way of proceedings is regulated in the internal employer's policies or procedures. And what should be underlined here is an essential part of whistleblowing reporting system, which is an internal investigation led by a person appointed by a given employer. The internal proceedings is governed mostly by the internal regulations of the given entity. And when analyzing the institution of whistleblowing, it should be underlined that sanctions for hindering a whistleblower or retaliatory actions foreseen in the Polish legal system are differentiated and non-consistent. The newly adopted EU directive on the protection of whistleblowers is an opportunity to implement a coherent system of internal investigations in reaction for irregularities or wrongdoings. And what should be stated here is the issue of interoperability between proceedings I presented. There are several models possible in this sphere. Let me briefly present them. The first one is that the criminal and criminal-related liability proceedings and disciplinary proceedings, as well as internal proceedings, can be led parallelly. The aims and way of conducting them, as well as authorities, bodies conducting the proceedings are different. All those proceedings can be defined as directed at the question of whether an unlawful act or omission has occurred. Criminal and disciplinary proceedings can be described as punitive ones. Both of them are related to kind of punishment. And what is more, there is another variant possible when the first stage is the internal proceedings, and due to its result, there is a criminal proceeding initiated. For example, after a whistleblower report or fraud or money laundering case in a financial company like an investment fund. And finally, the third possibility that due to the criminal investigation, a private sector entity decides to establish an internal investigation or audit to check whether the given case is not affecting the one in other dimensions than the case conducted before the public prosecutor's office. So each of the presented variants is possible to realize. Let me come to the conclusion of my presentation. Primary, I should indicate that the outline I presented today has a general theoretical approach. And just to sum up, it is worth pointing out that there are different types of proceedings that can serve as a legal tool to protect the financial interests of the EU. They cover both criminal liability and non-criminal liability ones. In the Polish legal system, we can find both external and internal proceedings which can interfere in different dimensions. Aims of the given proceedings are not totally identical, but what is a common factor for them, all of them, is that there are some universal rules of proceedings which can govern them. But that's a problem for another presentation. Thank you very much.